The wind was trying to kill him. Rafe Sutton couldn't see his own hands. He couldn't feel his face. The blizzard had swallowed the whole world. No sky, no ground. Just a screaming white wall of ice that ripped the breath straight out of his chest. He should be dead already. Every man on the Silverbow Range knew the rule. When a black norther hits, you don't move. You hole up and you pray. Men had frozen to death 50 feet from their own front doors on nights like this, wandering in circles until the cold took them. Rafe knew the rule. He'd broken it anyway. Because somewhere out there in that roaring dark was a warm house with a lit window, and in that house was Junie Hargrove, the rancher's daughter, the girl he'd loved in silence for 3 long years, the girl he was certain he could never, ever have. Tonight he'd decided he'd rather die trying to reach her than spend one more winter too afraid to speak. His horse stumbled. Rafe nearly went down. Grabbed the saddle horn with a fist he couldn't feel, kept his eyes shut against the ice, and trusted the animal to find the way home, because his own eyes were useless now. Then his shoulder slammed into something solid, a wall. A log wall, the house. He'd made it. Rafe half fell out of the saddle, dragged himself along the logs to the door, and shoved it open. Heat hit him like a slap. Lamplight, the smell of coffee and wood smoke, and a dozen frightened people crowded into one room. And Junie Hargrove, standing by the stove, went white as a ghost. Her voice came out shaking. "Rafe, are you out of your mind? You rode back through that?" "Well, shucks, honey," he said, his lips too frozen to smile. "I figured I'd best come on in." Junie made a small, broken sound and ran straight into his arms. She didn't care about the snow melting off his coat. She just held on, and her tears were warm against his frozen cheek. "If I'd known you were out in that," she whispered, "I think I'd have died." For one heartbeat, Rafe forgot the cold. He forgot everything, but he shouldn't have, because what none of them knew yet. Not Rafe, not Junie, not one soul in that crowded room, was that this storm wasn't just trying to kill Rafe Sutton. It was going to take everything the Hargroves had left in the world. Every cow, every dollar, the whole ranch. Everything that had kept this family alive for 20 years was dying out there in the snow right now, and there was nothing any of them could do to stop it. By morning, they'd all be ruined. Unless a poor cowboy with nothing to his name could find a way to save them. And the answer, the strangest, most impossible answer any of them could have imagined, was hanging on a nail up in the loft, gathering dust. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how one broke cowboy saved an entire valley on the worst night of his life, you have to go back a few hours. Back to what drove Rafe Sutton to ride straight into a storm that should have killed him. Rafe rode for the Hargrove place, out on the Silverbow Range. It wasn't much of an outfit anymore. 3 brands, clinging to a green valley between 2 ranges of smoky hills. Good grass in good years. But there hadn't been many good years lately. Amos Hargrove owned it. A stubborn old cattleman with a jaw like a fence post. He'd put his own name on the loans of his 2 neighbors to hold the whole valley together. Now he could barely hold himself. The bad years had bled him white. One more hard winter and Silverbow would be gone. That winter had just arrived, riding in on the worst storm anyone could remember, and Rafe had everything to lose too. 500 head of his own ran with the Hargrove cattle, his whole stake. Everything he'd scraped together over years of $40 a month wages, banking on one dream, that someday he'd have enough to stand on his own 2 feet. Enough, maybe, to be worthy of a girl like Junie, because that was the wall between them. Junie Hargrove was the rancher's daughter. Rafe was a hired hand. On that frontier, in that world, the distance between them might as well have been 1,000 miles. He'd loved her from the first day he saw her. He could ride a lonely week and hear her laugh under the wind the whole way. At night by his fire, he could see her hair bright in the glowing smoke, her smile teasing him out of the flames, but he'd never once told her. What right did a broke cowboy have? So when the storm hit and caught him out on the far range, the safe thing was to hole up in a shack and wait. Rafe didn't wait. He saddled up in the dark, and he rode straight into the blizzard, toward the one place in the world he wanted to be. And he nearly paid for it with his life. Now he was inside, thawing by the stove, with Junie's tears still warm on his cheek, and old Amos Hargrove was standing in the doorway, watching them. For a second, something crossed the old man's face. His daughter in the arms of a hired hand. But Amos had bigger fears tonight than who his girl was holding on to. "Rafe," he said, "where'd you come in from?" "The Hat Creek Bluffs." Amos went still. "Are they there? The cattle? Are they under the bluffs? Answer me. Are they there?" Rafe's heart sank, because he knew what this answer would do to the old man. "No," he said. "There's no cattle under the Hat Creek Bluffs, Amos. I doubt there's 100 head left standing between here and the sock breaks." Amos stared like he couldn't believe his own ears. All night, he'd told himself the Hat Creek Bluffs were their one best hope, the one place the herd could survive. "If they drift before this wind," he said quietly, "hell itself can't save them." Junie's mother, Della Hargrove, spoke up from the stove, a sturdy woman with sober, steady eyes. "There's still a chance," she said. "Some of them might stand it in the Silverbow Bottoms." "I checked the Silverbow Bottoms," Rafe said. "The wind's tearing straight through there. Half the stock's already down. I tailed up near 40 head before dark, and they wouldn't hardly move. Just jerked their horns and bawled." He paused. "They're good as gone, Della. The ones I saw." The room went silent. Everyone there understood exactly what that meant. If the herd died, Silverbow died, and every family in that valley lost everything they owned. "We'll come through this yet," Amos said stubbornly. "In a couple hours, this storm's got to turn." "And if it doesn't turn?" Della asked softly. "By God," said Amos Hargrove, "it's got to." He stomped into the main room and slammed the door, but watching the fear on all those faces, Rafe understood one thing. The storm didn't care what Amos said it had to do. And it wasn't slowing down. It was getting worse. There was one more thing hanging over that house tonight. One more reason the ruin cut so deep. His name was Cyrus Kettleman. Della told Rafe about it in a low voice while she set out hot food for him. For 6 months, Amos had been begging old Kettleman to come out to Silverbow. Cyrus Kettleman had half the cattle money in the whole territory. If he put a block of his money into the ranch, it could save them, not just Amos, but everyone. And tonight, finally, Kettleman had come. He'd arrived just in time to watch the whole valley get wiped off the map. Rafe ate at the rough table, and Junie sat across from him. And for a little while, with Junie in front of him, nothing else in the world existed. "Rafe," she said softly, "will any of them make it? The cattle?" "A few of the tough ones, maybe." "Not many." The words burst out of her. "If this isn't a cattle country, then in heaven's name, what is it?" "It's grand cattle country," Rafe said, still believing it. "This just came at a bad time." "And now," she whispered, "what's ahead? 4. You and me." Rafe's hand tightened around his cup. 500 head of his own were dying out there tonight. His whole stake. If the herd was gone, so was his dream of ever being more than a hired man. "I'd better head south, find work, build a new stake." He couldn't meet her eyes. Someday, if the big brands don't grab all the range, he saw the tears come. He reached across the table and gripped her hand. "We've still got a chance," he said. "If the storm turns, some stock might pull through and the willow breaks. Meantime, We play up to Kettleman. We find a way out of this. I swear it. But even as he said it, he wondered if he believed it, and whether a poor cowboy with nothing left had any right to make a girl any promises at all. The main room was big. The place had been built as a barn before the family moved into it. A huge stove at one end glowed red hot, but it could only warm a small circle against the cold clawing through every crack in the walls. Outside, the blizzard howled like a living thing, wrenching at the logs, and the people just waited. They sat silent, sober, not hiding that they were listening for one thing, the barely possible turn of the wind, the one thing that might give them hope. Rafe crossed the room and shook hands with Cyrus Kettleman. The man had a long, hard face, smooth-shaved, with the heavy folds age puts into only the toughest skin. His smile was in his mouth alone. His eyes were old past, smiling, hard as rock drills. Looking into those eyes, Rafe knew there was no hope here. If morning showed the cattle dead, Kettleman would climb on his horse and ride away. He put his money where the numbers were, and tonight, every number was death. Rafe heard Della say, "It's not slacking. Seems like it's getting worse." And Amos's stubborn answer, "She's bound to turn." Then, silence again. They sat so still under the disaster grinding down on them that they looked less like his friends, and more like carved stone. And that was when Rafe did the thing that changed everything. He climbed the ladder into the loft, and he brought down his fiddle. He sat down between Della and Junie. "Rafe Sutton," Junie said, "don't you dare play that thing. If you do, I know I'll cry." "Me too, maybe," said Della. "That boy can make a fiddle ball like a baby." Rafe started tuning the strings. "This outfit looks like a pack of coyotes fixing to howl over old bones. Psst. What's Kettleman going to think of a crew like this? You'll only make everybody feel worse," Junie said. Rafe grunted, and the fiddle began to sing. It was a thin, shrill voice under the vast roar of the storm. He started with a sad old song about a cabin out on the Silverbow. He saw Kettleman's head lift slowly, like an old dog waking. Even that hard old man knew the tune. But the sad song only made the ruin hurt worse. Rafe saw it on their faces, the truth settling in, that the range had beaten them at last. That come spring, Junie and Rafe might be scattered to the wind, their paths split forever. He looked at Junie in a wordless plea. For a moment they held each other's eyes. "All right," Junie said. "I'll try." Rafe switched his tune. Quick and wild now, a fast, driving dance song. "Stand to your partners," he called. Junie sprang up, grabbed the nearest cowhand by the wrists, and hauled him to his feet. Nobody else moved. But those two danced, half square dance, half pure defiance. And Junie danced like a brightening flame, her red gold hair tossed loose, her boot heels hammering the floor. And slowly, the fire in her began to spread to the others. One couple joined, then another. Then old Amos himself got up and danced with Della. And when Rafe looked at Cyrus Kettleman again, he saw something he never expected. The hard old face had softened. Those drill-hard eyes were smiling. Rafe played 1 hour, then a second. He played until the fiddle got hold of every soul in that room and carried them along, but he couldn't carry them forever. And out beyond the walls, the storm was still hunting. When Rafe saw Junie tiring, the tune wound down. He strained his ears, listening for any change in the roar of the wind, any sign it was turning. No one spoke. They were all listening now. The waiting had become unbearable. Suddenly, Amos got up and lit a lantern. "Amos, you're not?" Della started. "I'm going out to check the wind." Cyrus Kettleman spoke for the first time in an hour. "Sounds to me like she might be turning." "She had to turn," Amos said. There was a strange, iron certainty in his voice, as if his own desperate faith could turn the storm by force of will alone. Rafe pulled on his coat and went out with him into the black, roaring dark. They fought their way around the house, the lantern hidden under Amos's coat. At the corner, the full blast of the norther struck Rafe backward and stole the breath from his throat. But something was different. He stood a moment, comparing the wind to what it had been 3 hours ago. It had eased. He was almost sure of it. Amos felt it too. The old man was pounding Rafe's arm with a fist like a sledge. If they were right, the back of the storm was broken. They gripped hands in the bitter cold and shook. Then they ran back around the house and nearly tripped over a black shape by the door. It was the frozen carcass of a lone steer. It had wandered blind against the log, stood there resting with its horns dug into the wood, and died on its feet in the whip of the storm. Rafe stared at it, and his hope wavered. But when they got inside, the fight was back in Amos's eyes. "She's broke," he told them all. "She's turned. We'll have the pony saddled before noon." For a moment, nobody moved, still dazed by the beating of the storm. Then a voice near the back said, without any conviction at all, "They'd better be in the sock breaks." And right then, the door rattled, and a blast of ice ripped through the house. A man stumbled in out of the storm. It was Hollis Vane, a powerful, square-built neighbor, staggering now with exhaustion. He'd cut his saddle blanket in two and wrapped the halves around his boots. His mustache and beard were solid with ice. Almost got the door shut. "Hollis." In God's name, Hollis had ridden down to the south fence to cut the wire, so the cattle could drift through it instead of piling up against it to die. He'd holed up in a shack, but the roof blew off and a wall caved in, and he'd had to come on, following the fence line home through the dark. His voice was flat. "Dead. We're finished, Amos," he said. "The big end of the cattle's already gone. Along the drift line they're piled up by the 100. Half of them were dead before I even got there with the cutters." "I thought the sock breaks." Amos started. "Toss." Hollis's voice rose with bitter anger. "Sock breaks, hell. All you'll find in the sock breaks is the ones that died there. We don't own 50 live cattle to the brand. I've been there. I've seen it. There's never been a crueler night in all the world." Nobody had anything to say. This was the end. Final. Utter. The end even to Amos Hargrove's stubborn faith. The storm could turn now, or blow forever. It made no difference. Everything was gone. Della turned quietly to the stove to get Hollis some coffee. Amos moved toward the main room like a man walking in his sleep, and Junie broke. She clung to Rafe, the tears running down her face. "It can't be true. It can't. We mustn't let it. You're the only thing I've ever wanted in all." "Junie," Amos called sharply from the doorway. She stiffened, wiped her face, lifted her head, and when she followed her father out, she was composed again, her chin high. But Rafe had heard what she'd started to say, and it lit a fire in him no blizzard could ever put out. Rafe followed her into the main room. Looking around at these people, gathered together one last time before the ruin scattered them, he saw the frozen steer through the window, horn locked against the outer wall, a monument to everything the night had killed. He saw Junie's hair, like a flame against the gray logs, and something in him snapped, not despair. Something fiercer. He caught up his fiddle again and dragged the bow across the strings in a long, wild, howling wail. Everybody jumped, stared at him. Rafe began to grin, a little crazy, out of the white heat of his own anger, and he began to play. "Stand to your partners," he shouted. For a moment they stood frozen. Then a young cowhand burst out laughing, a wild, roaring laugh that ended in a cowboy yell. He saw Junie laughing too, unsteady, and swept her off her feet, and suddenly something broke in that log house. The grip of disaster cracked and fell away, because now that the last hope was gone, There was nothing left to be afraid of. Neighbors pulled each other into the middle of the floor. Amos and Della joined in. Junie ran across and hauled Cyrus Kettleman up to dance with her. The fiddle ripped and sawed, and thin as its voice was under the roar of the storm, its song became the soul of something bigger than the storm itself. The soul of people who would not quit. They were of a dozen different bloodlines, those folks, but of one frontier. People with a stubborn, hidden courage that could bind them tighter than blood. The kind of people who would one day be called American. They took the very fury the storm had spent to destroy them and turned it into laughing, defiant, stamping joy, and slowly that cold room changed. It grew warm. Alive, the old barn became a home. The buffalo robes on the walls became riches. Even the icy drafts became reminders that here was shelter from the black wrath of the night. Rafe played on, pouring everything he had into the strings, and he did not notice the hard old eyes of Cyrus Kettleman, watching him, watching and thinking. A faint gray light was coming up over the edge of the prairie when Amos brought out a dusty bottle of whiskey he'd been saving for years. "Here's to the gone stock," Amos said, his eyes on the glass. "And the better stock we aim to get," said Hollis Vane. They drank without looking at each other. Then Rafe's fiddle began its last tune, the sad old song about the cabin on the Silverbow. The storm had died to a low, uneasy moaning now, and the fiddle no longer had to fight to be heard. They'd heard that song 100 times. But they figured they'd never hear it again, because come spring, Silverbow would be lost, and they'd all be scattered. Rafe set down the fiddle at last, the fire gone out of him, and went into the little lean-to room to fetch his coat. It was Junie's room. He stood there alone, rubbing a clear place on the frosted window, soaking up the feel of all the small things she'd lived close to, before it was too late, before he had to ride away for good. Junie came in silently and stood beside him. Her fingers touched his hand, and he gripped them hard. They stood there together, not looking at each other, watching the far chill east grow slowly brighter. And Rafe made himself say the thing he'd sworn he'd never say to a girl he couldn't provide for. "Junie, soon as there's a let-up in the work, I'd like to come courting, proper. I know I've got nothing. I know your daddy hoped for better. But I've loved you 3 years, and I can't ride out of here without you knowing it." Junie turned and looked at him, her eyes shining. "Rafe Sutton, you fool," she whispered. "Don't you know I'd rather have you with nothing than any man alive with everything?" And Rafe kissed her, there in the gray dawn, with the frost melting on the glass and the ruined range stretching out beyond. But the story wasn't over. Hollis Vane came clumping in behind him and touched Rafe's shoulder. "You're wanted in there." Rafe followed him into the main room, and what he saw stopped him cold. Cyrus Kettleman had a stack of papers spread on the table. He and Amos were arguing, and old Amos looked completely dazed. "I don't know what you mean," Amos kept mumbling. "Anything's for sale," Kettleman growled. "You keep control. That's my system. That's always been my system. But this," Amos fumbled, "there's nothing to buy. Our cattle are dead. Our notes. I've got a list of your notes. But what are you buying, man? Not cattle, there aren't any. Not range. The range is free. There's going to be cattle." Kettleman stood up, and his voice filled the room. "You're buying? No. I'll tell you what I'm buying." He looked around at every face. "People," he said. "I buy people. I've never bought anything else in my life. You think a bull-headed cowman can change that now?" He turned, and his eyes landed square on Rafe. "I sat in this room half the night," Kettleman said, "and I watched a poor cowboy pick up a fiddle and turn a room full of beaten, ruined people into a room full of fighters. Folks who dance under a killer storm with everything gone. They don't quit. They rebuild, and I put my money on people who don't quit. The room had gone dead silent. I want you, Rafe Sutton, Kettleman said. And you, Amos, and Hollis. Every family in this valley. This range isn't hurt. Grass grows back. All you need is money, and I have it. All we need is, Amos said. Good God, I've got a plan. Kettleman tapped the papers. We keep the 3 brands separate, same as before. New stock comes spring, and the money to carry every one of you through. You keep your land. You keep your name. You just take my backing and build this valley back. Rafe heard a choking catch in Junie's throat. Kettleman turned to him one last time, and the hard old eyes were almost warm. Son, I've bought and sold cattle 40 years. I've learned there's only one thing worth investing in, not grass, not beef. A man who plays a fiddle in a blizzard so the people around him won't lose heart. He nodded once. Name your wage. You're working this outfit. Rafe couldn't speak. He looked at Junie, and Junie looked at him. And it seemed the first young sunlight through the frosted window touched her hair with gold. Later, much later, when the papers were signed and the shouting had died away, Rafe and Junie stood together at the window of the little lean-to room, watching the dawn come up out of the far country. It made a long line of silver gray with a drift of color on top, delicate as wild rose blooms. It was the hour when Amos usually said, "Well, it's another day," and it was. Another day. But a different kind than any of them had feared. "Rafe," Junie whispered, "do you understand what just happened? We're not losing everything. We're keeping it. All of it." She looked up at him. "And I'm keeping you." Rafe pulled her close. "Soon as there's a let-up in the work," he said, "I'll haul timber. This ice'll make fine sledding. And come spring, Junie Hargrove, you and I are going to have the prettiest house in the whole Silverbow." Junie smiled up at him, tears and laughter both on her face. Outside, the last of the great storm moaned itself down to nothing. The range that had beaten them lay silent under a sheet of glaze ice. But it would come back. The grass would come back. The cattle would come back. And a poor cowboy who had ridden through a killer storm for a girl he thought he could never have. Rafe Sutton had walked out the other side of the worst night of his life with everything he'd ever wanted. The storm had come to take it all. Instead, it had handed him a future. And out beyond the frosted window, the first gold light of a new day broke across the frozen prairie. And for the first time in 3 long years, Rafe Sutton believed the best was still ahead.